I want to be honest about something before any of this begins. I am not a hero. I am not a scientist. I am not a soldier or a doctor or anyone with credentials that would make you trust a single word I'm about to say. My name is Orrin Cavish. I am 44 years old. I worked in a print shop in Flagstaff for 11 years until the owner died and his kids sold the equipment. Before that, I drove a bread route. Before that, I stocked shelves. I have no degrees. I have no military background. I have a GED I earned at 22 and a library card I wore through the magnetic strip. What I always had, was a feeling, a certainty that sat behind my ribs like a second heartbeat. The world was going to end. Not philosophically, not in a poem, physically, specifically, soon. I know what that sounds like. I've watched it register on every face I've ever said it to. The micro flinch, the polite retreat of the eyes. My ex-wife Claudia had a name for it. She called it my religion. She said it with the same inflection someone uses when they say a person has a condition. Orrin has his religion. By the time she left in 2019, she'd stopped being angry about it. She was just tired. The apocalypse is boring when it never shows up for dinner. But I need to say this clearly. I was not right for the right reasons. I had no data. I had no epidemiological insight. I did not identify a specific pathogen or model an outbreak curve. I read things, broadly, obsessively, without discipline. I read about colony collapse and Superfund runoff, and gain-of-function research and prion disease in cervid populations and soil pH changes in industrial agriculture regions. I read about aquifer depletion and antibiotic resistance and the mathematical fragility of just-in-time supply chains. I read about historical collapses. I read about what happens to complex systems when 3 or 4 marginal stresses arrive at the same time. And from all of that unstructured, undisciplined, self-taught reading, I formed a conviction I could not shake. Something was going to break. Not in a century, not in a generation, within my lifetime, within the decade. I set a date. This is the part that makes me sound clinically unwell, and I understand that. In March of 2021, I sat at my kitchen table in the rented duplex on Butler Avenue and I wrote on an index card. June 15th, 2026. I pinned it to the wall above my desk. It wasn't prophecy. It was a deadline, a commitment device, the way someone signs up for a marathon before they can run 3 miles. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know when it would happen. But I knew that by June 15th, 2026, I needed to be finished building, whatever I was building. The burned church found me before I found it. I was driving out past Sedona on 89A in November of 2021, following a rumor about surplus lumber from a demolished motel. And I passed it on a dirt spur off the highway, Chapel of the Resurrection. It had burned the previous summer during a wildfire that jumped the road and took a quarter-mile strip of scrub before the crew cut it off. The roof was gone. The walls were standing, but blackened. The stained glass had melted into colored rivers on the stone sills. The floor was ash and char over a concrete slab. The property belonged to a diocese that had already written it off. I found the records at the county office, condemned, uninsured, scheduled for demolition that had been deferred 3 times for lack of budget. I bought it for $4,000 in back tax sale. The county clerk looked at me like I'd asked to purchase a cloud. The first time I walked through the doorless nave and stood in the open air where the roof had been, I felt something settle. Not peace. Architecture. The walls were 18-inch sandstone block. The foundation was poured concrete, cracked but structurally continuous. The footprint was 38 feet by 70. There was a basement. Most people didn't know small Arizona churches had basements. But this one had been built in 1943 by a congregation that wanted cold storage for community food drives. The basement was intact. The fire had stayed above. I stood in that roofless nave and I said it out loud. To no one. To the carbon-stained walls. I am going to build inside you. And no one is going to know. The first year was demolition. I went out to the church 3 or 4 times a week, always alone, always in the early morning before the heat climbed past 100. I cleared the burned timber. I hauled charred pews and melted fixtures to a dumpster I'd rented and parked behind the tree line off the spur road. I pulled down the sections of roof frame that were still hanging. I swept, scraped, and shoveled the ash floor down to bare slab. Every load I took away made the space larger and more frightening. A roofless stone rectangle in the desert. A rib cage with nothing inside. The basement was where I began real work. It was roughly 20 by 40, with poured walls and a flat ceiling of reinforced concrete that had served as the nave floor above. The stairs came down from what had been a utility closet near the vestry. The air was cool and still and smelled like mineral dust and old newspapers. There were shelves along the south wall, rusted steel, still bolted to the concrete. The electrical panel was scorched, but the conduit was intact down to the junction. I could work with this. I had savings. Not much. 11 years at the print shop had given me a modest fund that Claudia hadn't contested in the divorce, because she'd considered my obsession a form of mental illness, and the money its medication. Better he spends it on canned goods than on something that hurts someone. Those were her words to her lawyer. I had $31,000. I set aside $6,000 for living expenses over the next 4 years and allocated the remaining $25,000 to the build. Every dollar had a function. I drew the plans by hand on graph paper at my kitchen table, working from library books on passive solar design, underground shelter construction, and rainwater harvesting. I measured the basement 3 times. I mapped every crack, every seam, every place where moisture had crept in. I designed a false wall system using reclaimed shipping pallets and foam insulation that would give me an air gap, a vapor barrier, and thermal mass without requiring any professional contractor. The water system came first. I dug a catchment trench along the outside of the north wall, routed it through PVC to a 1,000-gallon poly tank I bought used from a rancher in Camp Verde. $60. I plumbed a gravity feed from the tank through a ceramic filter into the basement. I tested the flow rate every week for 3 months. It held. When the monsoons came, the tank filled in 2 days. I added a second tank, then a third. No one asked what I was doing. That was the thing I hadn't anticipated. I'd prepared elaborate explanations. I was converting the property into an art studio, a desert retreat, a storage facility. But no one drove down the spur road. No one noticed. The church had been condemned and forgotten. It existed in a bureaucratic void, too damaged to be valuable and too remote to be curious about. The nearest structure was a decommissioned gas station 2 miles west. The nearest occupied residence was a ranch house 4 miles south. I was invisible. This is important for what comes later, because the solitude that made the build possible is the same solitude that made me into someone I did not recognize. I talked to no one about what I was doing. I had no friends in Flagstaff by then. Claudia was in Tucson with her new husband. My mother had died in 2018. My brother Dale lived in Ohio and called once at Christmas to verify I was alive. The church became my only relationship. I spoke to it, not metaphorically. I addressed the walls when I was grouting. I narrated my decisions to the stairwell. I thanked the basement when the temperature stayed at 62 degrees on a day the surface hit 109. I installed a composting toilet system. I built sleeping platforms from reclaimed lumber, stacked too high, enough for 8 people. I did not know why I built for 8. I was one person. But the graph paper had said 8, and I'd drawn the bunks, and I followed the drawing, because following the drawing was easier than asking who else was supposed to come. The food storage filled slowly. Every week I bought an extra $20 to $40 of non-perishables: rice, dried beans, canned vegetables, powdered milk, salt, honey, cooking oil. I vacuum sealed what I could with a second-hand machine. I logged every item in a ledger: description, calorie count, date stored, and projected shelf life. By the end of the first year, I had roughly 900,000 calories in the basement. Enough for one person for about 14 months. Enough for 8 people for less than 60 days. The index card on my wall said June 15th, 2026. I was building on faith. My own unsubstantiated, undisciplined, irrational faith. And the calendar was already moving. The second year, I made the church look worse. This was deliberate. I needed the surface to repel, not attract. I drove rebar stakes into the ground around the perimeter and wrapped them in rusted wire I pulled from an old fence line. I scattered broken glass along the approaches. I left charred timber in visible piles near the road. I let weeds grow thick against the walls. The stained glass rivers on the sills I left exactly as they were, melted, lurid, suggesting heat damage too severe for the structure to be habitable. From the road, if anyone had bothered to look, the Chapel of the Resurrection was getting worse, not better, collapsing into itself. Not worth stopping for. Underneath, I was building the most careful thing I'd ever made. I sealed the basement ceiling with waterproof membrane and added a second layer of rigid foam. I installed a ventilation system using 4-inch PVC routed through the old utility conduit, with 2 intake points hidden among the rubble on the surface and an exhaust vent disguised as a collapsed pipe stack. The airflow was passive, driven by the temperature differential between the cool basement and the hot surface. It moved roughly 40 cubic feet per minute. Enough. I built a concealed entrance. The original staircase from the vestry closet was obvious. Anyone exploring the ruin would find it. So I sealed it. I poured a concrete cap over the top of the stairs and covered it with rubble to match the floor of the nave. It looked like a collapsed section. Then I cut a new entrance from the outside through the north foundation wall behind the water tanks. A passage barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Hidden behind a pallet of stacked stone that appeared to be debris, but was mounted on a pivot I'd welded from truck axle components. You pulled a buried lever, the pallet swung out 18 inches, and behind it was a 4-foot-high tunnel that dropped into the basement at the far end of the north wall. I tested it in the dark. I tested it carrying weight. I tested it in rain, in wind, in the brutal midday heat when the stone burned through my shirt. It took 14 seconds to enter and reseal from outside. It took 11 from inside. Those numbers mattered to me. I wrote them in the ledger next to the calorie counts, as if seconds and calories were the same currency. By the middle of year 2, I started doing something I cannot fully explain. I began writing letters, not sending them, writing them, to specific people. I sat in the basement at the plywood desk I'd built under the single LED strip powered by a deep cycle battery, and I wrote to people I had identified as candidates. This is the word I used in my own mind. Candidates. People who might be useful. People who might be willing. People who, If the world ended on or before June 15th, 2026, I wanted inside these walls. The first letter was to a woman named Paz Aguilar. She ran the community garden in Flagstaff's South Side neighborhood. I'd met her twice at the farmer's market. She was calm and knowledgeable, and she carried seeds in her pocket the way some people carry keys. She knew soil. She knew growing seasons. She knew how to make things come out of the ground. The second letter was to a man named Griffin Yates. He was a paramedic with the Sedona Fire Department who had once treated me for a cut on my hand when I sliced myself on sheet metal at the church. He'd sutured me on site without asking why I was bleeding alone at a condemned property. He had a stillness about him that I recognized. He did not fill silence with noise. The third was to Claudia. I wrote it and burned it the same night. Then I wrote it again the next week. Then burned it again. This cycle repeated more times than I want to count. I did not send any of the letters. Not yet. They sat in a drawer in the basement desk, sealed and stamped, addressed to real people at real addresses. I told myself I was waiting for the right time. I told myself I'd know when the moment came to deliver them. But looking back now, I think the truth is simpler and uglier. I was not building a shelter. I was building a trap. And the letters were bait I was too afraid to set, because setting them would mean admitting that I was the kind of person who lures people into bunkers with promises written in the language of concern. I sent the letters on March 3rd, 2026, 3 months and 12 days before my own deadline. I do not remember a specific reason. There was no precipitating event, no news headline, no dream. I woke up and I drove to the post office and I mailed 4 envelopes. Paz Aguilar, Griffin Yates, a woman named Therese Okpara, who taught high school biology and ran the mycology club at the public library, and a young man named Levi Strand, 23, who worked at the hardware store on Route 66 where I'd been buying supplies for 4 years and who had never once asked me what I was building. The letters were identical. I had drafted and redrafted the text dozens of times in the basement, reading it aloud to the walls, listening for the sentence where it tipped from convincing to unhinged. The final version was 3 paragraphs. It said, "I believe a catastrophic event will occur within the next 6 months. I have built a shelter that can sustain 8 people for approximately 180 days. If you are reading this and you think I'm delusional, you're probably right. If you keep this letter anyway, the directions below will bring you to the shelter. There is no obligation. There is no organization. There is only a building and a person who wants it to be useful." I signed it with my full name. I included my phone number. I drew a small map on the back of each letter showing the spur road off 89A, the tree line, and an X where the north wall pivot entrance was located. I did not explain the mechanism for opening it. I figured if they came, they'd call. No one called for 6 weeks. I checked my phone obsessively, an act that felt absurd given that I was a man who believed civilization was ending. But the silence was specific and personal in a way that the larger silence wasn't. These 4 people had read my letter and decided I was exactly what everyone had always decided I was. A quiet man with a loud disorder. Then Paz called. April 17th. She didn't mention the letter. She asked if I still came to the Saturday market. I said sometimes. She said she had extra mesquite seedlings and remembered I had property south of town. Would I like some? I said yes. We met at the market. She handed me a cardboard flat of seedlings, and then, without transition, she said, "How deep is the basement?" I told her, 20 by 40, 7-foot ceiling, reinforced concrete. She nodded. She said she'd lost a brother in the Sonoran crossing in 2009 and that she had kept a go bag by her front door every day since. She said the letter didn't scare her. She said what scared her was that she'd read it and felt relieved that someone else had a plan. Paz came to the church the following weekend. I showed her the approach, the debris field, the pivot mechanism. She crawled through the tunnel without hesitating and stood in the basement and turned in a slow circle, reading the space the way she read soil, for what it could yield. She pointed at the sealed staircase above and asked what was on the other side. I told her it opened into the nave, which was exposed. She said we should build a greenhouse up there. The roofless nave was a ready-made solar enclosure. All it needed was plastic sheeting and raised beds. I had not thought of this. In 4 years of obsessive planning, I had not thought of growing anything. I had counted calories in cans and bags and sealed pouches, and I had never once considered that the burned nave above my head was a garden waiting to happen. This is what I mean when I say I am not the person you should trust with any of this. Griffin called 2 days later. His message was 9 words. Got your letter. I've seen things at work. When? Therese never called. Levi came to the hardware store register one morning in May and slid my letter back across the counter with a small penciled note in the margin that said, "What kind of ventilation?" I told him. He said he'd want to see the intake points before he committed to anything. He came the next Saturday. He spent 3 hours inspecting every joint, every seal, every angle of PVC. He left without saying whether he was in or out. He came back the following Tuesday with a truck bed full of corrugated steel roofing panels he'd pulled from a demolition site. By June 1st, 2026, 4 people had seen the basement. 4 people had my phone number and the map and the knowledge of the pivot entrance. None of them had moved in. None of them had committed. They were doing what I had done for 5 years. Preparing without believing, building without admitting what the building was for. My index card said June 15th. 14 days. On June 7th, Paz brought her 13-year-old niece Alma to the church without asking. She simply arrived with the girl standing beside her, a backpack over one shoulder, looking at the ruin with an expression I recognized from my own mirror. Not fear, but inventory. Paz said her sister was in Phoenix and had stopped answering the phone 2 days ago. She said Alma was staying with her now, and wherever Paz went, Alma went. This was not a request. I had built for 8. I had written it on graph paper and followed the drawing. But I had imagined 8 adults. 8 capable, contributing, consenting adults who understood the terms. Not a 13-year-old girl who looked at the pivot entrance and said it smells like a mine and then crawled through without being asked. That evening, Paz and I sat in the basement while Alma explored the sleeping platforms and opened the ledger and began reading my calorie counts with the focused attention of someone doing homework. Paz said, "We need to talk about what you told people." I said I told the truth. She said no. She said I had told each person a slightly different version of the truth, calibrated to what I thought they needed to hear. She had compared notes with Griffin, who had received the same letter, but a different phone call. In my call with Griffin, I had mentioned the medical supplies I'd stocked, emphasizing that a trained medic would find them useful. In my first meeting with Paz, I had led with the growing potential, the solar exposure, the soil she could work with. For Levi, I had highlighted the engineering, the ventilation, the water system, the structural questions only he would think to ask. She was right. I had customized the pitch. I had read each person and offered the facet of the shelter that would resonate with their specific identity. I had done this automatically, the way I had once arranged bread displays to match the traffic patterns of each store on my route. It was not malicious. It was not even conscious. But Paz was looking at me across the plywood desk with an expression that was not anger, but something more dangerous. Clarity. "You're good at this," she said. "Getting people to come to you. That's not the same as being good for people." I didn't answer. Alma looked up from the ledger and said, "You're missing fiber. Your calorie plan has almost no fiber. Everyone's going to be constipated inside a month." Paz laughed. It was the first laugh that had ever occurred inside the basement. The sound bounced off the concrete walls and came back slightly changed, and the space itself felt different afterward, as if the walls had been waiting for a frequency they could finally absorb. Griffin arrived on June 9th with a medical kit that made mine look like a convenience store first aid shelf. He had packed suture sets, broad-spectrum antibiotics, a manual blood pressure cuff, a portable ultrasound unit he'd signed out from the station, and clearly did not intend to return, and 14 liters of saline in soft bags. He also brought a folding cot, a sleeping bag rated to 15 degrees, and a framed photograph of a woman I later learned was his ex-wife, who had died of pancreatic cancer in 2023. He set the photograph on the shelf beside his cot and did not explain it, and no one asked. Levi came on June 11th with more steel panels and a welding rig powered by a generator he'd borrowed from a job site. He spent the entire day on the surface, welding a frame over the nave opening, a skeleton that would eventually support the plastic sheeting for Paz's greenhouse. He worked without speaking. When Alma brought him water, he accepted it with a nod and kept his mask down. June 12th, June 13th, June 14th. My deadline was approaching with the slow, grinding certainty of a dentist appointment. The 5 of us were in the basement each night by then, though none of us were living there yet. We gathered in the evenings and ate together and talked about logistics and avoided the only question that mattered. What if June 15th comes and nothing happens? What if June 16th is ordinary? What if these 4 people crawled through a tunnel because a strange man wrote them a convincing letter and the strange man was wrong, had always been wrong, and the bread route and the print shop and the GED were the whole story? I lay on my sleeping platform that night, June 14th, and I listened to the ventilation system pulling desert air through the PVC, and I thought, tomorrow you will be either vindicated or finished. There is no third option. June 15th arrived like any other desert morning, dry, bright, and indifferent to human deadlines. I drove to the church at dawn and opened the pivot entrance and sat in the basement alone. No one else was coming that day. It was a Sunday. Paz had Alma at a birthday party in town. Griffin was on shift. Levi was at the store. I sat at the desk and I looked at the index card I'd brought from my apartment wall, and I waited for the world to end. It didn't. Not on June 15th. I want to describe the specific quality of that silence. It was not the absence of catastrophe. It was the presence of my own miscalculation sitting in the room with me, like a guest I'd invited who'd brought nothing and wouldn't leave. I had spent 5 years and $25,000 and every unit of social capital I possessed on this date. I had convinced 4 people to take me seriously. I had drawn them into my architecture, and the world was fine. At 3 p.m., I drove back to Flagstaff and bought groceries at Safeway and stood in the checkout line behind a woman arguing with a cashier about expired coupons, and I thought, this is the rest of your life. Ordinary, ordinary, and wrong, and ordinary. I did not call anyone. I did not go to the church for 3 days. On June 18th, Paz texted, "Are you okay?" I replied, "No." She texted, "Neither is Jess." Jess was her sister in Phoenix, still not answering. On June 19th, I went back, not because of the deadline, not because of conviction, because the basement was the only place I had built anything real. And without it, I was a man with a GED and a bread route, and nothing. The first visible evidence arrived on June 22nd. And it did not come through the news. It came through Alma. She was at the church with Paz, helping seed the first raised bed in the nave greenhouse. And she showed me a video on her phone. A friend of hers had reposted it from a cousin in Tucson. The footage was 11 seconds long, shot vertically from a second-floor apartment window. In the parking lot below, a man was walking with his arms at his sides and his head tilted at an angle that human neck muscles do not support. Another figure joined him from behind a dumpster. Then a third. They were moving in the same direction, not running, walking with a mechanical, insistent rhythm, like people late for something they couldn't name. The video had 400 views. No news outlet had picked it up. The comments were split between hoax and homeless and drugs. Alma watched my face while I watched the screen, and she said, "That's real, isn't it?" I said I didn't know. She said, "You know." I called to Griffin. He answered on the first ring. He said the Sedona station had received 3 calls overnight from the village of Oak Creek, reports of individuals walking on the highway, shoulder unresponsive to traffic, to horns, to physical contact. One caller said she'd gotten out of her car and touched a man's arm, and he'd turned his whole body toward her and opened his mouth, but the sound that came out was not a voice. Griffin said the shift commander had written them up as psych calls. He said he'd gone to one of the locations and found blood on the guardrail and nothing else. It was not June 15th. I had been wrong about the date, but I had not been wrong about the thing itself. Paz arrived at the church that evening with Alma and 2 suitcases and a flat of seedlings in the back seat. She did not ask if this was it. She did not ask for confirmation. She carried her suitcases through the tunnel and set them beside her sleeping platform and began transferring the seedlings to the raised bed. Griffin came at midnight, still in his uniform. He said there had been 6 more calls. He said the dispatch tone had changed. He said there was a word circulating among the medics that no one was using on the radio yet. Levi arrived at dawn on June 23rd with a welding rig, 40 gallons of fuel, and a face that looked like it had aged 6 years overnight. He welded the pivot entrance reinforcement without being asked. He added a secondary latch. He tested the seal pressure. Then he came downstairs and sat on the floor with his back against the wall and said, "I drove through a group of them on 89A, 5 or 6. One of them turned toward my headlights and started walking at the truck. He said the walk was fast, but not running, purposeful, like a person who sees a bus they're about to miss. We were 6 in the basement now, Paz, Alma, Griffin, Levi, me, and whatever was in the air above us. My deadline had been wrong by 7 days. I took no comfort in the proximity. By the end of June 23rd, we could hear them on the surface. Not their voices, they did not vocalize in any pattern I could call language, but their footfalls. The church sat on sandstone, and the stone transmitted impact vibration down, through the foundation, into the basement walls. The footsteps were irregular but persistent. One set, then another, overlapping and fading and returning. They were passing through. The spur road off 89A was a corridor, and the church ruin sat beside it like a rest stop no one needed, but everyone passed. Paz was the first to establish a protocol. She did it without announcing it, which was how Paz did everything. She wrote a schedule on the back of a seed packet and pinned it to the wall above the desk. Water check, 6 a.m., air filter inspection, noon. Battery charge level, 6 p.m. Grow light cycle for the nave beds, dawn to dusk, manual switch, no automation. She assigned herself the water check and the grow lights. She assigned Griffin the air filter. She gave Levi the battery and generator maintenance. She gave me the radio scan. I had a handheld shortwave that I'd stocked but never used. She gave Alma the food inventory because Alma had already claimed the ledger and was maintaining it with more discipline than I ever had. No one objected. No one asked who put Paz in charge. She had not put herself in charge. She had simply begun governing, and governing, it turns out, is just the act of being the first person to write things down. I need to talk about the radio. I had purchased a Teksun PL660 shortwave receiver and a Baofeng handheld two-way, both of which I'd stored in the basement with spare batteries and a small solar charging panel. The shortwave pulled in fragments, not broadcasts. Those had gone erratic within the first 48 hours, cycling between emergency tones and dead air. What I heard were other people. Amateurs, hams, preppers. People with better equipment than mine, scanning and transmitting and trying to build a picture of what was happening from the mosaic of their individual vantage points. A man in Prescott said the hospital was on fire. A woman outside Winslow said Highway 40 was impassable in both directions. Vehicles stopped in lanes, doors open, occupants gone. A teenager, his voice cracking between child and adult, said he was on the roof of a Walmart in Cottonwood and could see them filling the parking lot below like water rising in a basin. He said they weren't attacking each other. He said they moved in the same direction, east, always east. He asked if anyone knew why they went east, and no one answered. I listened. I did not transmit. This was a decision I made in the first hour, and it was the most important decision of those early days. Every time I heard a voice calling out for response, for confirmation, for company, I held the Baofeng in my hand, and I did not press the button. Because transmitting meant being findable. Transmitting meant becoming a point on someone else's map. And I had built this place to be absent from every map. This decision would cost me, not immediately. But it established something about who I was inside the shelter, and who I was willing to be, that the others absorbed without comment. Oren listens. Oren does not answer. Oren built this place to hide, and hiding is what he does best. On the third day, Levi climbed up through the nave. We had agreed that surface access would happen only through the original sealed staircase, which I had capped with concrete. Levi chipped a small observation port through the cap, just wide enough to look through, not wide enough to crawl through. He lay on his stomach on the basement stairs and looked up through the port into the roofless nave and reported what he saw. The greenhouse frame was intact. The plastic sheeting Paz had begun attaching was half secured, flapping in the wind. The raised beds were undisturbed, and standing in the center of the nave, motionless, facing the east wall where the altar had been, was a woman in a blue hospital gown. She was barefoot. Her feet were black with road dust and blood. She was not moving. She was not looking at anything. She was standing in the exact center of the space, as if she'd come to church. And the service hadn't started yet. Levi watched her for 20 minutes. She did not move. He sealed the observation port and came downstairs and sat on his cot and said nothing for 2 hours. The woman in the nave left on her own after approximately 31 hours. Levi checked through the observation port each morning and evening and logged her position. She stood in the same spot for the first day. Then on the second morning, she had moved 3 feet toward the east wall. By the second evening, she was gone. She left no trace except 2 black footprints on the concrete slab. Alma named her the parishioner. This was the beginning of Alma's naming system, which would expand over the following weeks to include every recurring figure visible through the port. The man who circled the building clockwise every 4 hours became the deacon. A pair that always appeared together, walking in the same mechanical tandem, became the ushers. A child, and this was the one that none of us discussed at length, who appeared once, standing in the doorless threshold, and then never appeared again, was called Advent. I noticed that Alma's names were all ecclesiastical. She was not religious, neither was Pa's. But the building imposed its own vocabulary. We were living in a church. The dead were visiting a church. The language of congregation kept surfacing regardless of our beliefs. During the first week, the shelter operated on the logic I had designed. Closed system, minimal surface exposure, consume stored resources, wait. But Paz's greenhouse had changed the calculus before the emergency even began. The raised beds in the nave were planted. Seeds were in soil. And seeds do not care about quarantine protocols. They need light, water, and someone to check on them. Which meant someone had to go up. Paz went on the morning of June 27th. She climbed the stairs, pushed through the observation port that Levi had widened into a hatch, and spent 40 minutes in the nave tending the beds. Griffin waited at the bottom of the stairs with his medical kit and a fire extinguisher, the closest thing to a weapon we had. Paz came back down with dirt under her nails and a report. The beds were sprouting. The plastic sheeting had held. The nave collected heat like a kiln and retained moisture from the beds. The conditions were close to optimal. The only problem was the deacon, who had passed within 10 feet of the nave's doorless south entrance during her time above and had not turned toward her. This established what became our working understanding. They responded to sound, not to scent, not to movement, not to visual stimulus at distance. Sound. Paz had been silent on the surface, and she had been invisible. When Levi tested this by tapping a wrench against the staircase pipe while monitoring the port, the deacon stopped mid-circuit and oriented toward the building within 3 seconds. We became a silent community. This was not a rule Paz wrote on a seed packet. It was something that happened to us organically, the way a forest goes quiet when a predator enters. We stopped talking at normal volume. We whispered. We padded our footsteps on the concrete floor with layers of cardboard and old fabric. We communicated in gestures, in notes, in the lexicon of glances that develops between people sealed together in a small space who cannot afford to make noise. Alma adapted fastest. She moved through the basement like a thought present, purposeful and nearly silent. She maintained the ledger without being asked. She tracked the shortwave frequencies and compiled a notebook of what she heard, organized by location, date, and what she classified as reliability, her own assessment of whether the speakers sounded coherent or compromised. She rated them on a scale of 1 to 5. The teenager on the Walmart roof in Cottonwood was a 5. A man claiming to be broadcasting from Laughlin, who said the infected were communicating through electrical wires, was a 1. Griffin had less to do than he'd expected. No one was injured. No one was sick. The medical kit sat organized on its shelf, and Griffin checked it each day as his schedule demanded, and then sat on his cot and read a novel he'd brought, a ice or a water-stained paperback of Lonesome Dove that he turned through with the focused patience of a man accustomed to waiting between emergencies. When I asked him once if the quiet bothered him, he looked up and said, "Quiet is what I came here for." Levi was the one who concerned me. He worked constantly. He reinforced the pivot entrance. He added bracing to the staircase hatch. He built a second observation port on the west wall. He fabricated a rainwater pre-filter from steel mesh and gravel. He welded, sawed, drilled, and hammered. And every sound he made was a risk. And every risk was a decision I had not been consulted on. When I raised this on the 7th night, Levi looked at me with the flattest expression I had ever seen on a human face and said, "You built this place to survive. I'm building it to last. Those aren't the same thing." He was right, and I resented him for it. On July 4th, a Saturday, a woman appeared at the pivot entrance and knocked. Not the mechanical arrival of the infected. A knock. 3 deliberate raps on the stone pallet, followed by a voice. "Hello? I can see the lever." I read about levers in the letter. Is someone inside? Her name was Della Royce. She was 37. She had been driving north from Phoenix when the highways collapsed and had spent 11 days walking cross-country with her 6-year-old son, Micah. She had found the letter in the Flagstaff post office, wedged behind a sorting bin. It was not addressed to her. It was a letter I had written and never mailed, a 5th draft, to a person I'd ultimately decided not to contact, that I had brought to the post office and then abandoned on the counter in a moment of doubt 6 months earlier. The postmaster had apparently swept it behind the bin. Della had gone to the post office looking for any sign of organized evacuation. She'd found my letter instead. She was standing outside my hidden entrance with a child, reading the directions I'd written for someone else and asking to come in. I was alone in the basement when she knocked. Paz and Alma were in the nave tending the beds. Griffin was sleeping. Levi was at the west observation port. I heard the knock, and I felt something I had not felt in 5 years of building. The physical weight of consequence. Every design decision, every calorie counted, every pallet of stone positioned to conceal all of it, converged into this single moment. Someone had found me. Someone needed in. And letting them in would break the math. I had built for 8. We were 6. The arithmetic said yes. The arithmetic had always said yes. But I had designed the arithmetic for people I had selected, vetted, customized letters for. Della Royce was not in my plans. Her son Micah was not in my plans. They were random. They were the universe's way of saying, your spreadsheet is not the world. I opened the entrance, not because I'd made a moral calculation, not because the arithmetic allowed it. I opened it because she had used the word lever, and I had put that word in the letter. And the letter was my handwriting. And my handwriting was a promise I didn't remember making, but could not unmake now. Della crawled through the tunnel carrying Micah on her back. He was silent. Not sleeping, his eyes were open and tracking, but silent with the particular learned silence of a child who has been taught that sound is dangerous. His shoes were duct taped together. His hands were clean, which meant Della had been washing them with water she couldn't spare. Paz came down from the nave 20 minutes later and found a woman and a boy sitting on the floor eating rice from a pot I had heated on the propane burner. She looked at me. I waited for the question. She said, "Micah, do you like tomatoes? Because I think we're going to have some in about 3 weeks." Griffin examined both of them. Della had blisters covering both feet from heel to toe, a deep abrasion on her left shoulder from the backpack strap, and mild dehydration. Micah had a respiratory rate of 24, slightly elevated for his age, and a bruise on his shin he said was from a fence. Griffin treated the blisters, dressed the abrasion, and gave them each a half-liter of water with electrolyte powder. He recorded everything in his medical log and then sat back down and opened Lonesome Dove. Levi said nothing to Della for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, he built a small shelf beside the sleeping platform she and Micah were sharing and placed a battery-powered reading light on it, angled so Micah could see the ceiling from where he lay. He still said nothing, but the light was aimed with precision. We were 8. The graph paper number? The drawing I had followed without knowing why. And for 2 days, I let myself believe the plan was working. Della was the one who found the other letters. I should have anticipated this. I should have locked the drawer or destroyed them. But I had been living alone in this space for so long that I'd forgotten it contained evidence of anything besides survival logistics. The desk had 3 drawers. The top held the ledger and radio logs. The middle held tools and spare batteries. The bottom held the unsent letters, the early drafts, the abandoned versions, the index card, and my notebooks. Della was looking for a pencil for Micah. She opened the bottom drawer on the morning of July 8th and found 23 letters in various stages of completion, addressed to 11 different people, each containing a different version of the same pitch, each calibrated to a different person's psychology. She read them at the desk while I was in the nave helping Paz with the irrigation lines. When I came down the stairs, she was sitting with the letters spread across the plywood surface in a grid she had organized by date. Alma was beside her, reading over her shoulder. Paz was standing at the foot of the stairs behind me. I didn't know how long she'd been there. Della held up a letter addressed to a man named Ray Fonseca, a retired electrician I'd met at a gun show. The letter said, "I've built a shelter with a serious electrical infrastructure problem that only someone with your experience could solve. I'm not asking for help. I'm offering a place where your skills would matter when nothing else does." She held up another, addressed to a woman named Claudia Spreen, my ex-wife's full married name, that said, "I know you think I'm unwell. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to remember that I was right about the foundation crack in the Butler house 18 months before the inspector found it. I was right about the printer's chemical ventilation before the OSHA report. I've been wrong about many things, but I have never been wrong about structural failure. Come and see the shelter. If I'm wrong, you will have lost an afternoon. If I'm right, you will live." Della laid this letter on the desk and looked at me and said, "How many people did you write to who you didn't invite?" 11, I said. She said, "How many of those people would have come if you'd sent these?" I didn't answer. She said, "You wrote a different personality for every letter. You figured out what each person was afraid of and what each person was proud of, and you built a bridge between those two things. That's not communication. That's recruitment." Paz, behind me, said nothing. I could feel her silence like a barometric change. It was Alma who spoke next. She had been reading the Claudia letter again. She said, "You wrote this 12 times. She fanned the drafts across the desk, each one a different length, a different tone, a different calibration of desperation and restraint. She said, you couldn't figure out which version of yourself to be for her. This was true. It was also the most perceptive thing anyone had ever said to me. And it came from a 13-year-old sitting cross-legged on a concrete floor in a basement while the dead walked overhead. Griffin, who had been listening from his cot, closed his book and said, "Oren, did you send the letters you sent because you believed those 4 people were the best candidates for survival, or because you believed they were the 4 most likely to say yes?" I wanted to lie. The shape of the lie was already in my mouth, curved and smooth, ready to be delivered with the precise emotional calibration I had trained myself to deploy. But Paz was behind me, and Alma was in front of me, and Della was holding the physical evidence of my manipulation, and the basement was too small and too quiet for anything but the truth. I said, I chose the people I thought I could convince. Not the people who would have been best, the people I could get. The room held that sentence the way the walls held sound, completely without escape. Levy, from the west observation port, said without turning around, "You also chose the people who wouldn't challenge you. Everyone in this room is either younger than you, quieter than you, or needed something from you before they arrived. You built a cabinet, not a community. No one spoke to me for the rest of that day. Not in anger, in recalibration. I could feel the social architecture of the basement shifting around me like tectonic plates adjusting after a quake. I had been the builder, the planner, the person who had made the space and filled it with provisions and set the terms of entry. Now I was the person who had been exposed. And exposure in a sealed space is not something you recover from by apologizing. It's something the group metabolizes at its own pace. Paz resumed the schedule without modification. Griffin checked the air filters. Levi inspected the batteries. Alma updated the ledger. Della cleaned the sleeping platforms with a rag and a bucket of water and told Micah a story about a rabbit who lived in a hole under a hill and charged other animals rent. Micah laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh. The sound was so foreign in the basement that Levi turned from the port and stared, not at Micah, but at the walls, as if checking whether the concrete could absorb joy without cracking. I sat at the desk, and I looked at the letters spread across it, and I began, for the first time, to see myself from the outside. Not the version of myself I'd narrated internally for 5 years. The prescient loner, the dedicated builder, the man who loved the world enough to prepare for its end. The other one, the one the letters revealed. A man who studied people the way he studied supply chains, for points of leverage. A man who built a shelter and then populated it with people selected for their susceptibility to a specific brand of persuasion. A man whose conviction about the end of the world was real, but whose method of response to that conviction was indistinguishable from control. I had not lied in the letters. Every fact was accurate. The shelter was real. The threat was real. The invitation was genuine. But genuine and honest are not the same thing, and the gap between them was wide enough to hold everything I'd done wrong. On the second day of silence, Paz came to the desk and sat across from me and said, "We need to talk about governance." I said, "Okay." She said, "Right now, this place runs on your infrastructure and my schedule. That's not governance. That's 2 people managing a building. If we're going to stay here, and we have to stay here, then this place belongs to everyone equally, including Della, who you didn't invite, and Micah, who can't consent. The food is communal. The water is communal. The decisions are communal. You built this, and I honor that. But you don't own it anymore." I said, "Okay." She said, "And the radio. We need to transmit." This was the line I had sworn I would not cross. Transmitting meant being locatable. Being locatable meant vulnerability. I had built the church to be invisible. Every burned timber on the surface, every piece of scattered glass, every inch of deliberate decay was designed to say, "Nothing is here." Transmitting would undo all of it. I said no. Paz said, "There are people out there who are dying because they don't know safe locations exist. Your shortwave has been picking up voices for 2 weeks. You've logged 63 individual transmissions. 41 of them included a request for shelter or directions to safety. You heard them, and you wrote their frequencies in a notebook, and you did nothing." I said, "If we transmit, they'll come. Not just people, them." Paz said, "If we don't transmit, we survive in a hole and let everyone we could have helped die in the open. That's not survival. That's burial with better ventilation." Alma from her sleeping platform said, "It's also math. 8 people with this much food last about 4 months. 30 people with a working greenhouse and 2 more growing seasons could last indefinitely. You built for 8 because you were thinking about subtraction. Paz is thinking about multiplication." I did not have an answer for a 13-year-old who understood systems better than I did. I had spent 5 years counting down. I did not know how to count up. Griffin said quietly from his cot, "I'll transmit. Use my name, my credentials. The frequency draws them to me, not to you. Your shelter stays hidden. I'll broadcast from the surface, from the nave. If they come to a burned church. They find a ruin. The basement stays sealed. The tunnel stays secret. We let people in one at a time, on our terms. It was the most words Griffin had spoken in a single sequence since he'd arrived. And it was, I realized, a plan that accommodated both my fear and Paz's conscience, without requiring me to be anything other than what I was. Griffin made the first transmission on July 11th at 6 a.m. from the nave, standing among the raised beds, with the baofeng held close to his mouth, speaking just above a whisper. He identified himself by name and profession. He gave the general area, northern Arizona, off 89A without specifics. He described the shelter as a reinforced basement with water, food, and growing capacity. He said, "If you can hear this and you need a place, respond on this frequency between 0600 and 0605 daily. No other window." He did not give directions. He did not describe the building. 3 people responded the first morning. A family of 2, a man named Howard and his teenage daughter Renata, transmitting from a gas station roof near Munns Park, and a woman named Suki, alone, broadcasting from a car she'd been living in on a forest road east of Flagstaff. Griffin took their positions and signed off. Then he came downstairs, and we had the first of what Paz called intake meetings, which were really just the 8 of us sitting in a circle deciding whether to bring strangers into our home. Howard and Renata arrived on July 13th. Levi met them at a landmark half a mile from the church, a distinctive rock formation I will not describe further, and walked them in blindfolded. This was my condition. If the shelter's location was going to spread, it would spread through a single controlled point. No one who arrived could retrace the route precisely enough to find us again without guidance. It was manipulative. I knew it was manipulative. Paz knew it was manipulative. But she also knew that an open-door policy in a world of ambulatory dead was not idealism. It was a death sentence with better intentions. Howard was 51, a retired utility lineman, with hands like geography, scarred, mapped, capable. Renata was 16 and carried a hunting rifle she handled with the familiarity of someone who'd learned young. They had been in Munns Park when the outbreak reached their neighborhood and had watched their home become unreachable over the course of a single afternoon. Howard did not describe what they'd seen. Renata described it once, to Alma, late at night when they thought no one was listening. I was listening. I will not repeat what she said. It is hers. Suki arrived on July 14th. She was 29, Japanese-American, a former wildland firefighter who had left the service after a knee injury and had been working as a bartender in Flagstaff. She walked through the tunnel, stood up in the basement, looked around at the concrete walls and the sleeping platforms and the LED strips and the shelf of canned food, and said, "This is the ugliest, beautiful thing I've ever seen. Who built it?" I raised my hand. She looked at me with an expression I could not categorize and said, "You're smaller than I expected from the radio." I said Griffin was the radio voice. She said, "I know." I meant the guy behind the radio voice is always bigger in my head. She said it without smiling, and then she asked where the bathroom was. We were 11. The graph paper had said 8. The calorie math was eroding with every arrival, but Paz's greenhouse was producing. The first tomatoes came in on July 15th, small, misshapen, grown in soil that had been ash 3 months earlier. Paz sliced them with a pocket knife and gave each person a single slice. The taste was so far from canned food that Micah cried. Not from sadness, from the shock of something being good. The radio drew more. By the end of July, We had taken in 19 people. Howard's lineman skills had the solar array operating at triple my original output. Suki organized surface security silent patrols through the nave at scheduled intervals, monitoring the approaches without making contact. Renata and Alma formed a communications team, logging every short-wave transmission and maintaining a contact ledger that grew to 47 entries across Arizona and southern Utah. The shelter was succeeding, not because of my design, because of what it had become after my design stopped being sufficient. Paz's growing calendar, Griffin's medical protocols, Levi's structural reinforcements, Howard's electrical work, Suki's patrol routes, Alma's data management, every system that made the place work had been built by someone other than me. I had built the walls. They had built the thing inside the walls. On August 2nd, during Paz's morning schedule review, Levi stood up and said, "We need to vote on something." The basement was crowded. 19 people in a 20 by 40 space. Some slept in the nave now, in sheltered alcoves that Levi and Howard had enclosed with steel and plywood. The greenhouse occupied half the roofless ceiling. The church was becoming a village, and the village had never decided who governed it. Levi said, "Oren built this place. He chose the site, poured the concrete, installed the water, designed the entrance. He also manipulated every one of the original residents into coming here using customized psychological appeals." Della found the letters. We've all read them. He selected people for compliance, not capability. He withheld the radio to keep us hidden when broadcasting could have saved lives weeks earlier. He designed this shelter as a private vault, and we converted it into a commons against his preference. He said all of this without anger. He said it the way he welded, precisely, structurally, with the heat necessary to join the pieces and not a degree more. He said, "I think we should vote on whether Oren continues to have a decision-making role in this shelter, not whether he stays. He stays. He built this. He deserves the safety he made. But the question is whether the person who built a bunker to control has the right to govern a community that exists because it outgrew his control." The room was silent. 22 people in a concrete box. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere above, the deacon was making his circuit. His footsteps transmitted through the stone like a metronome that didn't know the song was over. Paz spoke first. She said, "Oren is not a bad man. He is a frightened man who built a good thing for bad reasons, and it became a good thing for good reasons despite him. I think the question isn't governance. It's trust. Do we trust him?" Howard said, "He let Della in. He didn't have to." Suki said, "He let Della in because his own letter was in her hand, and his ego couldn't survive refusing his own invitation." This was brutal and, I think, partially true. Griffin said, "I trust his fear. I don't trust his instinct to manage it by managing us. He should build. He should maintain. He should not decide who comes in, who stays, or what we broadcast." Della said, "I'm alive because his letter ended up behind a bin. My son is alive. I don't care why he wrote it. I care that it existed." Micah, sitting on Della's lap, said nothing. He was drawing on a piece of cardboard with a pencil stub Alma had given him. He was drawing the church. The lines were surprisingly precise for a 6-year-old. He had included the greenhouse sheeting and the raised beds, and the observation port, and in the basement below, a row of stick figures that he'd labeled in careful block letters. Paz, Griffin, Levy, Alma, Mama, me, Mr. O. Alma held up the drawing and said, "He put you in the basement, Oren. You're inside. He sees you as inside." The vote was 12-7, with 2 abstentions. I was removed from operational decision-making. I retained my sleeping platform, my share of food and water, and full access to the shelter. I was, in the framework Paz proposed and the group adopted, a resident. Not a director, not a founder. A resident of a place I had built, which had been taken from me by the people I had lured into it, who had made it better than I ever could have, and who were right to take it. I sat on my platform that night, and I looked at the concrete ceiling, and I listened to 19 people breathing in a space I had poured and sealed and stocked. And I waited to feel destroyed. I waited for the anguish of dispossession, the rage of the builder denied his building. It didn't come. What came instead was a sensation I did not have vocabulary for until days later, when Alma, observing me from across the room with her usual forensic clarity, said, "You look lighter." She was right. The weight I had carried for 5 years, the solitary, crushing, self-assigned burden of being the only person who saw the end coming, is gone. Not because the end hadn't come. Because I was no longer the only person responsible for what happened after. By September, the church sheltered 31 people. The Nave greenhouse produced enough supplemental food to extend our stored supplies by roughly 40%. Howard and Levi had reinforced the perimeter with a buried cable alarm system that used vibration sensors to detect approach without emitting sound. Suki's patrol teams operated in rotating shifts of 3, moving through the surface ruin in choreographed silence. Griffin maintained a clinic in the southeast corner of the basement where he had treated everything from infected blisters to a dislocated shoulder to a panic attack that lasted 9 hours. Paz ran the council. 5 members, elected monthly, with no consecutive terms. I was never nominated. I was never asked to serve. This was not punishment. It was architecture. The shelter needed me to be the person who maintained the walls, not the person who decided what happened inside them. I grouted. I patched. I checked the water lines and the ventilation ducts and the pivot entrance mechanism. I became the building's immune system, responding to structural threats with the same obsessive attention I had once applied to the end of the world. Della taught. She had been a middle school English teacher in Phoenix before everything. And she resumed her profession in the basement with an audience of Micah, Alma, Renata, and 3 other children who had arrived with later groups. She taught vocabulary and composition, and once, a unit on persuasive writing that she introduced by reading one of my letters aloud to the class, without identifying the author. The students analyzed the rhetorical strategies. Alma, who knew exactly who had written it, said nothing. She gave the letter a B+. I began writing again. Not letters, not to anyone. I wrote an account of the build, the decisions, the costs, the timeline. I wrote about the pivot entrance and the calorie ledger and the date on the index card. I wrote about the letters and what they revealed, and why I had written them the way I had. I wrote honestly, or as honestly as a person who has been caught manipulating can claim to write. I left the pages on the desk, unsealed, available. Paz read them. Griffin read them. Alma read them and corrected my grammar. One evening in late September, I was in the nave checking the irrigation lines when I heard the deacon making his circuit. I had not been on the surface alone in weeks. The sound of his footsteps that measured mechanical rhythm on the sandstone was closer than I expected. I pressed myself against the wall and watched through a gap in the steel sheeting as he passed the south entrance. He paused. I stopped breathing. He stood at the threshold and his head turned toward the interior of the nave, toward the raised beds, the plastic sheeting, the evidence of habitation that was invisible from the road but obvious from 3 feet away. He looked at the tomato plants. He looked at the lettuce. He looked at a watering can Paz had left beside the nearest bed. Then he turned away and continued his circuit. He did not enter. He did not vocalize. He simply looked, assessed with whatever machinery operated behind his eyes, and decided that a garden was not what he was searching for. I came downstairs shaking. I told Paz. She said, "He's been doing that for weeks." Suki logged it. He looks in, he leaves. We think the growing things confuse the signal. Life that isn't moving, roots in soil. Something about it doesn't register. I said, "The church is protecting us." Paz said, "The garden is protecting us. The church is just where I planted it." That night, I understood, finally and completely, what I had done wrong and what I had accidentally done right. I had built a hidden haven. I had designed concealment, isolation, control. Every feature of the original shelter was meant to subtract, to remove us from the world, to reduce our signature, to disappear. And then Paz had come and planted seeds in the ashes, and the seeds had grown, and the growing was what made us invisible. Not the stone walls, not the pivot entrance, not my obsessive silence, the garden. Life continuing in a burned place. The dead looked at it and saw nothing they wanted. The living looked at it and saw everything they needed. I had built a tomb and Paz had turned it into a greenhouse, and the greenhouse had done what the tomb never could. It kept us alive, not by hiding us from death, but by being so relentlessly, specifically alive that death could not parse it. I still live in the basement. My sleeping platform is the original one I built in the first year. The wood now smoothed by use to a polish I never sanded. 31 people breathe above and around me. The greenhouse produces year-round. The radio broadcasts every morning at 6. Griffin's voice steady and clear, reaching further now with an antenna Howard mounted on the old bell tower stanchion. 12 other shelters have made contact. A network is forming. Paz coordinates. Alma logs. I maintain. Micah's drawing still hangs on the wall. Mr. O, inside the building. Among the stick figures. I did not earn that placement. I was assigned it by a child who didn't know what I'd done, who only knew that I was here and that here was safe. Some days, that feels like absolution. Most days, it feels like the most precise judgment I've ever received. You are present, you are included, and your name is the smallest on the page. I knew the world would end soon. I was right. I built a haven. I was wrong about what a haven was. A haven is not a locked room. A haven is a room you built that someone else unlocked, filled with people you didn't choose, growing food you didn't plant, governed by rules you didn't write, surviving for reasons that have nothing to do with you. The index card is still pinned above the desk, June 15th, 2026, 7 days off, close enough to ruin a life, far enough to prove that prophecy is just anxiety with a calendar. The church stands, the garden grows. I am inside. I am not in charge. For the first time in 5 years, both of those things are true at once, and I can sleep.